Hello again. In this lesson, we'll focus on phrasal or sentential semantics. The first question that needs to be asked is how we process and understand sentence meaning. In other words, what is the thing that gives sentences their meaning? Something that is obvious when we see is that by combining different elements, the meanings of every individual element will become part of the whole meaning of a word or a sentence. For example, when you have the combination you plus are plus adjectives, we can make different combinations. You're fired, you're delicious, you're stupid, you're welcome, and you're wrong. All of these will have a different meaning because we are changing words and we're using adjectives with different meaning. So something very obvious is that the combination of the different elements and the meaning of these elements will combine to create combined meaning in a sentence. This is what we call the principle of compositionality. That means that the sense of a sentence is going to be determined precisely by the rules that allow us to combine all of its elements and then still know under what conditions this sentence is true or false. In other words, what meaning it has. Also, we can summarize it in this way. The meaning of the sentence is determined by the sum of the meanings of its parts. A second point worth mentioning is that sometimes the words that will be used within a sentence may have multiple meanings, and this may lead to ambiguity. Here are some examples of some sentences. If we read them carefully, we will see that Dr. Smith will give a talk on the moon can be understood as whether Dr. Smith will give a talk on the topic of the moon, about the moon, or whether he will be on the moon giving a talk. So all of these sentences that we see here are ambiguous, and something important is that we need to use pragmatic knowledge, that is information about the context, in order to disambiguate these sentences. In other words, to understand what is the meaning that is being intended. So once we know that the combination of the meanings of the words will be part of the meaning of the new sentence, and that we know that sentences could be ambiguous, let's look at another semantic phenomenon that could happen here. Let's read these sentences. I'm hungry, I'm starving, I could eat a horse, or my stomach thinks my throat is cut. If we see all of these have a similar meaning, however, only number one can be interpreted using the literal meaning of the elements. The other words have a more figurative language that needs to be analyzed more careful to understand the meaning of the sentence. For example, a person cannot eat a horse, or a person cannot be starving, because starving is a very strong word when people actually die from hunger. In the same case, my stomach thinks my throat's cut is giving the stomach human characteristics. There's a personification of the stomach because the stomach thinks, right? So, and therefore, even though the four sentences have the same meaning, we can clearly see that B, C, and D have an element of figurative language. In other words, we should not take the elements in their literal meaning. Thus, we can see that metaphors and idioms do not respect the principle of compositionality. In other words, we cannot take the meanings of the words in a literal sense. Here are some examples. The Lord is my shepherd, birds of a feather flock together, all the world is a stage, it takes one to know one, but a giant lived for mankind, and he tasted her mind and realized he'd been starving. Some of these expressions are metaphors, and some of them are idioms. There are some important differences between a metaphor and an idiom that we will see in a moment, but right now it is important to mention that both in metaphors and idioms there is no respect for the principle of compositionality. You cannot analyze the meaning of the sentence by taking the added literal meaning of each word. So, we will begin by exploring metaphors. We're going to talk about the definition of a metaphor, We're going to provide some examples, and we're going to see where exactly in the language we can find metaphors. Now let's begin with the definitions. A metaphor is traditionally understood as a figurative expression of the form X is Y. This means that they identify subjects with a class of entities to which they do not literally belong. In other words, we talk about something in terms of something else. Another important point is that a metaphor is creative. We can create an infinite number of metaphors, and that's why there's poetry, because language is creative. And also, the metaphors can be dynamic. This means that we can change, we can compare different things and create different kinds of mental images. On the other hand, idioms are expressions that function as single units. This means that in the same way that you analyze a word, you can analyze an idiom. The meaning cannot be worked out from the separate elements, just one unit, and of course they are frozen collocations, which means that you cannot alter an idiom. You have to learn it the way that it is. You cannot change the parts, and also the meaning is not going to change over time, which is the case of a metaphor. Now let's look at some examples, and we will determine whether these are idioms or metaphors. I demolished his argument. They fell in love. Our economy stability is under attack. The relationship is in really good shape. He was filled with anger but had to swallow it up. I'm looking forward to your party, and your conclusion is weak. In each of these instances, we can see that there is an element of figurative language, because the first sentence, for example, is talking about arguments as if they were buildings that can be demolished. The second one is talking about love as if it were a disease that can be contracted, right? And so on and so forth. So each of these sentences contain instances of metaphorical language, but they are used to talk about everyday things. We can clearly see then that these are not idioms, but they are metaphors, and they are expressing things in terms of some other things to which they are compared. The importance of metaphorical meaning for semantics is that it is just as systematic as conceptual denotational meaning is. And also, it is very important to see how metaphorical meaning is expressed, because it is not exclusive of literary language. So contrary to what people usually believe, all of our language, our everyday language, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. So, while the idioms are just phrases that should be learned in the same way that we learn words, metaphors are based on semantic processes of denotation. In other words, they are using some meaning from some units to express them in terms of some other concepts. And this is the nature of metaphorical language. I will now show you some examples to demonstrate that metaphors have a conceptual basis and that are systematic in nature. Let's begin by talking about this orientational metaphor. Happy is up and sad is down. If we look at this metaphor, we can see that it can be realized in specific sentences in many different ways. For example, I'm feeling up. This boosted my spirits. My spirits rose. Thinking about her always gives me a lift. I'm feeling down. He's really low these days. His spirits soared. She fell into a depression. He's really low these days. My spirits sank. In all of these different instances, we can see that the metaphor happy is up and sad is down is expressed in different ways. And of course, it's important to understand that the physical basis of this metaphor is that a drooping posture typically goes along with sadness and depression. On the other hand, an upright, erect posture corresponds to a positive emotional state. So that is, we can understand all of this expression as meaning happy or sad, even though the word happy or the word sad are never mentioned. This is another example. Conscious is up and unconscious is down. Then again, we have get up, wake up, she's already up, he rises early in the morning, he fell asleep, he's under hypnosis. The last example is he sank into a coma. And then again, in all of them, we can see that there is a systematicity of the concept. This means that the physical basis of this metaphor is that humans and most other mammals sleep lying down, but then they stand up when they're awakened. And therefore, we can associate the meaning of up as being conscious as the meaning of down as being unconscious. And this is another conceptual metaphor that we use in everyday language. So the importance of metaphors and semantics is that by providing a conceptual framework, such as the one expressed in ideas are buildings and ideas are food, we can create a really great number of metaphorical expressions that relate ideas or arguments to buildings or to food. For example, your argument is shaky, her thesis is falling apart, your paper needs a strong theoretical framework. Is that the foundation of your theory? This theory needs more support. In the same way, for the ideas are food metaphor, we can have expressions such as that idea has been fermenting for years, what she said left a bad taste in my mouth, these students are used to be spoon-fed, his theory is a collection of half-baked ideas, and that argument smells fishy. We can see that we have a concept that is relating two separate entities and it's expressing them in a different way, so that we can create some other metaphorical expressions by using this comparison. The last thing that we can say about metaphors is that because they are based on concepts and experiences, we may find similar metaphors in different languages. So this means that metaphors are not language specific and can be shared across different languages, of course, in different realizations or different instances. Another important concept to understand sentential meaning is that of deixis. In these examples, we will see how deixis is used to indicate proximity or distance. I'll put this here. She'll come back tomorrow. Your sister's car is parked there. We're all very tired. Me da permiso, por favor. Llegué ahí antes que tú. We can see that all of the underlined words here correspond to indexicals or diacritical markers, and they of course are going to indicate relationships of distance and proximity. We'll talk about this in just a moment. Deixis then is a semantic concept that means pointing via the language. So this means that when we use diacritic expressions or indexicals, we're going to refer to things as being near us or away from us. There are three kinds of deixis: person deixis, temporal deixis, and spatial deixis. So whether we're talking about people, about time, or about space. This figure illustrates how deixis works. When a person speaks, he or she becomes the diacritic center, and every person or place or time that he or she is going to talk about will be at a relative distance or proximity. If we talk about temporal deixis, we can see that now is the diacritic center, and the past and the future are the extreme sides of a continuum. On the other hand, when we talk about space deixis, here is the diacritic center, and there can be different places in which the speaker is not in that moment. Finally, if we talk about person deixis, we can see that the center is I or me, and then there could be some other people are relatively different proximity, such as you, which will be after I, and then he or she, who will be farther from the person who is speaking. So these are the three different ways in which deixis is expressed in the English language. Just to show an example with person deixis, we can see that the person who speaks is the deictic center, and then the person to whom the speaker is speaking becomes the proximal you, the interlocutor. If we use a specific term such as usted or vous to talk about a person, which doesn't exist in English, obviously the person is farther than the proximal you. And finally, the people who are more distant from the speaker will be he, she, or they. And if we see, that's what we call I, the first person, you, the second person, and he, she, and they, the third person. The arrow shows then the distance from the speaker. He, she, or they are farther from you, and I is the deictic center. These are some deictic expressions or indexicals in the English language. For person deixis, we have I, me, myself, which indicate deictic center, you, yourself, which is the proximity, and we have you singular and you plural. And of course, in some languages they use tu or usted. Usted will be farther from the speaker. And finally, the most distant persons that we are going to talk about are he or she, him or her, himself, herself, and of course they and themselves. We have finally we that can be used in an inclusive way to include the speaker and other people, or an exclusive we that will refer to the speaker and some people as compared to some other people outside of this group. And we can see this illustrated in the difference between let's go, where we're going to go together somewhere, and let us go, where we're asking permission to go somewhere. Concerning space deixis, we can find the distinctions between here and there, come and go, this and that. Finally, temporal deixis can be indicated with now, then, later, yesterday, tomorrow, last, next week, specific dates, and it is important to mention that we depend on knowledge of the time of the utterance to interpret these expressions. For example, we'll be back in 1 hour. We'll need to see when this notice was posted so that we can understand when the hour is going to end. And in the same way, it will be closed tomorrow. We need the specific date where this was posted so that we can understand the date that we are talking about and know when the store or the place will be open. Even though deixis is a semantic concept, it can be used in a context to express pragmatic information. For example, when we speak, sometimes we want to get farther from or closer to things or people or places that we are talking about. Let me show you one example. This question is very simple. What grammatical tenses would you use to tell an anecdote, story, or something that happened to you? So normally you would think that because the story happened in the past, and in a way it's far from you because it's not in the present time, the truth is that we're going to use the present tense to tell our anecdote or story, because when we move it to the present time, the story becomes more vivid, more interesting, or funnier. And this is something that we call a deictic projection. We bring something from the past into the present time so that our interlocutor can be more interested in the things that we say. In a similar way, other examples of deictic projection include I'll come tomorrow instead of I will go tomorrow, and I am not here, in which we express that we want to distance ourselves from our interlocutor. These are only some examples of how we can express pragmatic meaning by changing our indexicals. I will explain only 2 of them. In the first example, a wife to her husband will probably say Su Majestad quiere otra cerveza to make him understand that he's probably doing nothing and he's acting as if he were a king, and that is why she is distancing herself from him by calling him Your Majesty, and also by addressing him in the third person. In the same way, when a mother says to her daughter, somebody didn't clean this place, instead of saying you didn't clean your room, she is trying to distance herself and showing her daughter that she is not happy and that there will be trouble. Politicians use we to indicate solidarity and to make people believe that they belong within their project, to make them vote for them, obviously. Friends can get closer to some others by saying ya sabes, which indicates complicity, or distance ourselves from other people when we call them ella in third person and not using the name of the person. Same thing in a store. This is very funny. Hoy no fío, mañana sí. That means that no matter where you go, the things will never change. You're not getting credit. And finally, in a funeral, we have this expression that is very commonly used, se nos adelantó, in which we have the use of we to show solidarity and empathy, and then adelantó to show that the person is in another place. That means even though they are mourning the person is already in another place. So we're transposing the spirit of the person in another place, and this is obviously related to the metaphor that death is a place where, of course, we are going to go one day. So, these were the most important points in sentential semantics. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will be seeing you next time.